morning, guys. Good morning. You know, it's a little bit of a smaller morning for us, but there's a reason. It's not just people aren't showing up. We've had a men's retreat, and you know, a lot of dudes are out at the men's retreat this weekend. By the way, it's actually been really, really cool. So we started with, at the beginning of the week, so I was down there Monday through Friday. We started with, at the beginning of the week, this large concrete slab, and on it now is this enormous, ridiculously large barn, which should be just about completely finished on the outside by the end of the weekend. So by today, probably some metal on. When I left, the barn was sheeted on its roof. It just needed some tar paper and then metal on it to have it fully enclosed. So it's really exciting just to see and hear about what was able to be done with a bunch of volunteers go down to Gateway and Garden Camp and build stuff. And that was the point, right? The retreat was the build retreat. So we've been building some things, but also, of course, building relationships and connections and having some great spiritual conversations. So it was a really, really great time. Highly encourage anybody that had not come down on this men's retreat to come to the next one, or just to show up at random times, because now there's people out of camp all the time, pretty much throughout the whole summer. Then there's a women's retreat that's going to be coming up soon, so that's a thing too that you can do, and we'll talk about that later. But at any rate, this week we're going to be jumping into Nehemiah chapter 11. For the last few weeks we've been covering kind of the spiritual revival of the people of Israel. And so a few weeks ago we talked about how the Israelites were standing up and listening to the Word of God, listening to the law of Moses, hearing what it is that they were supposed to be doing. We talked about how they confessed their sins to one another, how they humbled themselves before God. Last week we were talking about how they made a commitment to obey, and how they were fired up and they took so seriously this commitment to obedience that they even invoked a curse upon themselves if they were not going to be obedient. So they took this stuff very, very seriously. They're super fired up about getting back to God, getting back to living for Him, and getting back to obedience to Him in their relationships with God. And so it's a very exciting time at this point in time in Nehemiah. But here's the thing, right? As you talk about obedience and as you commit yourself to obedience, there's something that you learn very quickly, and that's that obedience to God is not always comfortable. Obedience to God is not always convenient. It's not always what you want to do. And as we jump into Nehemiah chapter 11 this morning, we're gonna get a little bit of taste of that, of this obedience stuff that maybe wasn't exactly what they wanted to do, but still chose to do anyway. And so let's take a look here. We're going to be in Nehemiah chapter 11, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now the leaders of the people settled in Jerusalem. The rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of every 10 of them to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while the remaining 9 were to stay in their towns. The people commended all who volunteered to live in Jerusalem." If you read this chapter ahead of time, you would have realized that these first 2 verses are pretty much all the narrative in Nehemiah chapter 11. And the rest of the chapter is just a list of names of all the people that moved to Jerusalem. So there's not a whole lot of content to kind of hang off of here as far as trying to figure out what was going on and preaching a lesson about it. But, you know, it begs the question. I read these verses and I thought to myself, why didn't people want to move to Jerusalem? Because this was, again, the holy city. This obviously was the spot that people should be wanting to live in, right? So why did they have to cast lots, basically do a lottery system, to get people to move to Jerusalem? And so I did a little bit of research, and you have to realize, up until this time, right, before this, about 80 years before this, when the first exiles had moved back to Jerusalem. So there's only been people in Jerusalem for about 80 years to this point. And remember, for the 70 years prior to that, Jerusalem was destroyed, abandoned, and pretty much left to rot. And so there were 70 years of nothingness, Jerusalem being this ghost town, essentially. And then you've got the exiles coming back, moving into the surrounding areas and into the city itself. And then you've got, obviously, you've got the temple being rebuilt. That's the book of Ezra. You've got the walls being restored. That's the book of Nehemiah that we've been talking about. And so Jerusalem is getting back together, but you'd imagine also that although you've got the temple and although you've got the walls, most of the city was still probably in pretty poor shape. And so, as much as it was the holy city, and as much as there was this spiritual revival going on, Jerusalem probably still was not this destination that people wanted to move to. And not only was it probably not in good shape, there's these other factors, right? Like, if you were going to move to Jerusalem, you had to, like, move. You have to pick up all your stuff and pack it and find a new place in the city. You have to move all your junk over there and then put it there and get a new place set up. Probably you have to find a new way of making money because what you were doing in the outlining areas for money was probably different than what you'd be doing inside the city. And then on top of all of that too, you probably might have experienced, a little bit of additional pressure living in very close proximity to the temple. Maybe you'd feel a little bit more pressure to actually have to live the life of the Jews at this time, as of the Israelites, because you're right there in the city with the temple. So there's all these factors here that, again, maybe make Jerusalem maybe less of a destination than maybe we think from our perspective. But despite all of those things, there were volunteers that decided to move. And despite all of those things, those that were kind of called out by the lottery, they obeyed and they moved. Despite the convenience, or the inconvenience, despite the uncomfortability of the scenario, despite the quality or lack of quality in the city, they chose to go. And what this reminds me of, it reminds me of a passage in the New Testament as people are talking about wanting to follow Jesus. There's this one particular would-be disciple that approaches Jesus, and this story here, this conversation is recorded here in Luke 9, verse 57. And Jesus is really laying out what it takes to follow him. Verse 57 of Luke 9, it says, as they were walking along the road, a man said to him, to Jesus, I will follow you wherever you go. Jesus replied, foxes have dens, and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. So Jesus makes it fairly clear to this would-be disciple about what he expects about those that follow him. Foxes live in dens. Right? Birds of the air have their homes in nests. But Jesus was on the move. Jesus had no place to lay his head. He did not have home. And so the call is clear. If we want to follow Jesus, we have to be willing to go. We have to be willing to move. Now, this could be, we could be talking very literally and physically here. Yes, at times there might be the call literally to physically move from city to city. Many of the people that planted the church here in Fairbanks did just that, right? They physically moved from Anchorage to Fairbanks to plant the church here, from other places that they moved to, right? But it goes beyond that. I think there's more to it than just that, because home is not just this physical place in which you live. Home is also representative of comfort. Home is representative of familiarity, the things that you're used to, and the comforts that come with doing the things that you like to do, and the things that you are used to doing, and the way that you're used to living. But here's the thing about the Bible. There is no call in the Scriptures anywhere to be comfortable. There is no call in the Bible for us to just remain with familiarity, to just be in a place where we just feel comfortable with the things that we're doing. It's just not in the Bible. And actually, it's very much the opposite of that. Luke 9 also, in Luke 9 talks about having to deny ourselves and take up our cross daily to follow God. Right? The Bible calls us to be strong and courageous. You see that in the book of Joshua. You see that in several different places in the Old Testament and the New. This call to be fearless, to go out there and to be bold and courageous for God, realizing that we have access to His power to help us confront those difficult, uncomfortable situations, circumstances like those. So my question for you guys this morning is, what is it going to take for you? What is it that you need to do to get out of your comfort zone for God? What is it that you need to do to get out of your comfort zone for God? Maybe it is sharing your faith with a coworker or a friend. Maybe it's going out to serve in a capacity that you don't really like. It's not your thing, the thing that you're excited about, but you're choosing to serve for God. Maybe it's as simple as asking for help, asking for advice, or asking for more accountability in your life, in your walk with God. Maybe it's what Naomi was talking about this morning. Maybe it's the help, asking for the help to forgive and to work through issues in your life like that. What is it going to take for you? What are those areas in your life, those uncomfortable areas in your life that you can give up for God? That you can approach God and get uncomfortable and do His will in your life. You know, these ideas, these notions like this are really not popular in modern day Christianity. This is not stuff that modern day Christianity as a whole likes to talk about, because modern day Christianity wants to be radical, but not too radical. Modern day Christianity wants to do great things for God, but doesn't want to ask too much of any given person. Modern day Christianity wants to make an impact, but doesn't really want to offend anybody along the way. And unfortunately, when those things are the basis, when our comfortability as a church, as a family of churches, as just Christianity overall, when we place comfort and we place the desire to be familiar above what God's will is for us, there are consequences. And the one that really stands out to me can be found in 2 Timothy chapter 3. And if you're familiar with the beginning of 2 Timothy chapter 3, it's a list of all of these kind of terrible things that are going on when people are not following God. So it gets on, it talks about arrogance, and it talks about being lovers of pleasure and lovers of money and so on and so forth, as opposed to lovers of God. And this is what really strikes me. When we try to go after our comfort over God, this is what happens in verse 5 of that list. It's having a form of godliness but denying its power. How often do we have this form of godliness because we're Christians, and because we go to church, and we do some Christian-y things, but we deny God's real power because ultimately we still place our own comfort and our own familiarity above God's will for us. God's power is displayed through those who are willing to be courageous, committed, uncomfortable. That's where you see God's power. But God's power is denied when we say, well, I'd rather be comfortable. I'd rather just do what I've always done. I'd rather just not challenge that area of my life. Or I'd rather not do something so radical because I think that's weird or whatever. And so my charge for you guys this week is simple. Go get uncomfortable for God. Be willing and make the decision to go for God. Or, on the other hand, be willing and make the decision to let go for God. And as you do that, just see how God will work through you, again, to accomplish His will for your life. Amen? Amen.